So I want to welcome everyone to the session. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for participating in the symposium. This is our last day of sessions, and so far they've been fantastic. And really continued the strength of from the energy and the strength and the knowledge from day one. So I appreciate all of you that have stuck with us, through to day 4. Really excited to have this panelist here together speaking about environmental justice issues related to stormwater. I've heard 2 of them speak before and kind of come away from both conversations and both lessons with so much knowledge about these topics that I kind of had a little bit of an insight into, but these are definitely the experts. So sit back and soak it in here. So with that, thank you panelists for joining me and joining the rest of us here today. I want to begin with your introductions, of course. So if you could please tell us about who you are, your organizations, and how your work is related to environmental justice and stormwater. And I'll start with Dr. Hendricks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Yan. Yeah, just brief introduction. I'm currently an assistant professor of urban studies and planning and the director of the Stormwater Infrastructure Resilience and Justice Lab in the School of Architecture at the University of Maryland. I'm also an affiliate of the Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health in the School of Public Health, as well as the Clark School for Engineering, Center for Disaster Resilience, National Center for Smart Growth, Research and Education, and the Environmental Finance Center. Essentially, my research is really centered on infrastructure planning and management, and sort of how infrastructure and how it's distributed across communities, what role it plays in modifying social vulnerability to disaster, environmental injustice, sustainable development. To date, my research is primarily focused on how social processes and development patterns create hazardous human-built environments and vulnerable infrastructure related to risk of urban stormwater management, particularly in terms of water quantity. Although, recently I've started to explore the connection between quantity and quality, and how these more intense and frequent wet weather events create circumstances by which, cascading effects between water quantity and quality, particularly in terms of sanitary sewer backups and overflows. And, essentially that's what I'm hoping to sort of talk about and contribute to the panel today.
Thanks. Amanda.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to be here. Thanks for moderating and for the great introduction. So I work for the University of Maryland, a program called Sea Grant Extension, and I'm a watershed restoration specialist there. So my focus is on stormwater. So I am learning today about environmental justice as much as I try and integrate it into my work. My day-to-day focus is stormwater, and so I'm happy to talk about the place where the two really come together in my field. And my job is to deliver sound science from the university into applied application at the community scale. And so I work with everyone from nonprofits to local governments to residents of Maryland to work on really the water quality side of things, but more and more the water quantity side of things as we experience climate change and flooding issues really that impact our communities. So that's the focus of my work. I'm really based in 5 counties in Maryland, but I work on statewide issues as well. So I cover Prince George's County, Montgomery County, Frederick, Howard County, and some of Anne Arundel County. And then I have colleagues who are spread across the state who are doing similar work just in different areas of the state. So I have a colleague based in Baltimore who is covering that area. And then the work that Paul's going to talk about a little bit covers our Baltimore area as well, some of our work there. Okay, I think that's a good good place to get started, and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Amanda. Paul?
Okay, thanks, Jan. Again, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks for moderating this panel. So my name is Paul Leisnham. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Technology here at the University of Maryland in College Park. So my role is as an educator and a researcher. So my goal is to educate students in science-based skills on how to better manage ecosystems, and they include those in the built environment, of course, and also how to be effective environmental stewards and promote ecological sustainability. I also lead a research program which is focused on studying the coupled human-natural systems, and more specifically how human behaviors can affect ecosystems and how in turn changes in ecosystems affect human health and well-being. The two systems that I'm really focused on are watershed sustainability and urban disease vector mosquitoes. And both of those systems are related, and that was how I really intersected with the topic of environmental justice. So as Amanda alluded to, I lead a project focusing on quantifying the strengths of important healthy and unhealthy stormwater human cycles and their feedbacks. And we're really focused on how do we use urban green space effectively, certainly with regards to stormwater management. How do we include communities in the decision-making process? How do we target areas within built environments to most effectively control stormwater and manage it? And how do we reduce impacts from urban disease vector mosquitoes? So in a nutshell, that's where I'm coming from. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks. And last but not least, Leah.
Hi, everyone. I am Leah Kelly. I'm a senior attorney with the Environmental Integrity Project. And EIP, we are primarily a legal and technical services organization. We're mostly lawyers, but we use a lot of data analysis in our work. We have, as an organization, we have several programs. Some of them are subject matter based and some of them are geographically based. My program is the Maryland program, and so we work on climate change and human health issues throughout the state of Maryland. But since 2011, we have had a program focused on environmental justice in Baltimore. And the main goal is to just address the worst issues that we can sort of, make a difference on that affect low-income communities and communities of color in Baltimore City and the immediately surrounding areas. And so as part of this work since 2015, we've been working on backups of raw sewage into people's basements in Baltimore City. This has been a chronic problem in Baltimore City for years, and I can get into, when we discuss a little bit later, I can get into exactly how that happened, but it's actually increased since around 2004, the number of sewage backups in people's basements, and for a long time it was not treated as a serious problem and sort of ignored by the city in terms of it happening, and also in terms of providing any sort of real meaningful assistance to residents. And so that's been, we've been involved in particularly in pushing the city to try to provide financial assistance and also direct cleanup assistance to residents who experience backups of sewage in their basements. Thanks.
So to get us started, for those of us coming to this topic with little to no kind of information, and I know some of you already kind of got at this in your introductions, but can you draw the line from stormwater through environmental justice to public health, or the triangle, how really break it down for us? What are the public health outcomes and impacts as they relate to stormwater environmental justice? And particularly, if you can, speak to the inequities in planning and zoning and infrastructure that create these stormwater issues. So I'll start with Marccus.
Yeah, well, I guess I really want to allow sort of the rest of the panelists to break it down, especially because I know Leah has done a lot of work, particularly in Baltimore over the years. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing her comments. I guess I'll just sort of frame it in terms of, just thinking about some of Dr. Robert Buller's early work. And I think a 94 piece he wrote in a health manuscript talking about, or really charging us to think about how the nation should redefine environment to include infrastructure, because there were certain problems related to infrastructure within our cities and communities, and issues of inadequate sewer treatment plants are in fact a threat to environmental health and public health. And the repairing and replacement of these types of infrastructures and upgrading them is critical, are critical needs and investments to communities. And then sort of as a follow-up to that, our leader for today's, symposium and the last couple weekends symposium, Dr. Jacoby Wilson, in 2008 was talking about the failure of municipalities to install up-to-code sewer and water infrastructure can essentially lead to vulnerabilities within these systems and can have sort of, existential consequences, direct, indirect consequences for communities, particularly communities of color and poor communities. And so I think, when it comes to infrastructure, I think we have to embrace that charge and recognize that infrastructure is a part of this total environment, right? That cuts across multiple dimensions. And when we talk about environmental justice or injustice, we have to, understand that not only are we talking about the natural environment, but we're also talking about the physical environment, the social environment, as well as sort of in light of COVID-19, the digital and virtual environment, right? And so I think, it's critical for us to recognize that and understand that, historically, I think environmental justice, started focusing on the more traditional issues that are much more visible, in terms of, locally unwanted land uses, petrochemical facilities. But when we think about issues of infrastructure, sanitation, these are more latent and invisible environmental threats to public health that folks live by every single day that don't necessarily get, an immediate lawsuit or a disaster declaration, but traumatize, impact households and communities in ways on a regular basis that are equal to that of circumstances of these more visible and catastrophic events. And so I think that's sort of the context that I think, many of us probably will be speaking from in terms of why sewage, stormwater are critical issues within an environmental justice framework.
Sure, I'll toss it over to Amanda then.
Sure. So, I mean, at its core, right, if we think about stormwater and environmental justice like an ecosystem, everything's related and everything sort of balances off of each other, right? And so if we're way out of balance with one thing, we're way out of balance with another thing. These, healthy water, healthy air, all contribute to healthy people and environments, right? And so we have to take a holistic approach when looking at these things. And I think we haven't done a good job of that to date, right? We see historical systematic racism that's played a role in our communities where we have access to clean water, clean air, right? Those types of things that are still happening regularly today. And so thinking about from the water quality side of things, we're seeing, streams in Maryland that we can't swim in, right? So we're trying to get to a state where we have fishable, swimmable rivers and streams. And so how do we, start to move towards that system is looking at clean water from not only the infrastructure, as Dr. Hendricks pointed out, the infrastructure side of things, as well as, sort of that gray-green mixture approach. So, thinking about traditional stormwater paired with these green practices that we want to see in communities, but also thinking about how to engage the community in that process. And I don't know that we've done that really well to date. So just a few thoughts, and I think, you know, it's a big topic, big question, so it could go in many directions with the conversation.
Sure, sure. Leah or Paul, do you have anything to add there?
I think I can jump in there, and then Leah, I'll let you speak. I'll be really brief. I think Marccus and Amanda gave a really good overview. As an environmental scientist and an ecologist, I think I'd like to bring up the issue of ecosystem services, because we often frame stormwater and the environment in terms of the services or the range of benefits that they provide that support human well-being. You know, this may be food, clean water, disease regulation, and a goal is to try and ensure that those benefits are spread fairly across populations and landscapes. And of course, human actions can erode and prevent access to those benefits. And so that's often where ecologists and environmental scientists come from. Just drilling down to stormwater and urban green space, when we think about green areas within cities, we want those green areas to provide those benefits of cleaning our water, to prevent flooding, and to provide aesthetically pleasing places. And so we can think of all these services, and the flip side, the risks that certain environments give rise to. So that was my contribution. I'll let Leah now jump in.
Sure. So I think when it comes to the public health impacts of sewage backups, and just to tie sewage backups into everything else that everyone's talking about, so it's absolutely an infrastructure. It's, you know, it's issue. It's pipes below the city, but it is directly related to stormwater. Baltimore City has a separate stormwater sewer system from its sanitary sewer system, but one of the biggest problems with both systems is that they're being overloaded with water from precipitation when it rains, which is being exacerbated dramatically by climate change. So, and stormwater can also infiltrate Baltimore's sanitary sewer system via cracks in the pipe. So it's an enormous factor in the sewage backups problems. But yeah, the public health risks associated with exposure to raw untreated sewage are massive. I'm just going to read this because this is what I always do. There are microorganisms, viruses, bacteria, and intestinal parasites that can be transmitted through exposure. And they can cause serious illnesses, including cholera, dysentery, hepatitis, cryptosporidiosis, and giardiasis. And there's a new potential threat, which is there are several studies, and Marccus published a great commentary on this in the Baltimore Sun a couple months ago. There's a potential risk of COVID-19 being transmitted through exposure to raw sewage. So it's a very serious public health risk when this happens in folks' basements. And it's also a really serious equity issue when it comes to low-income communities, because the cost of cleaning up sewage backups in your basement can be very, very high. We're still sort of trying to flesh out exactly the range, but it looks like, you know, $5,000 to $10,000 per backup potentially, and that's not including property loss. You know, if you have, for example, if your furnace is damaged in the basement, can be even more. And so, you know, that's very difficult for low income folks to deal with. I think, you know, I'll get into, when we talk about Baltimore City specifically, I'll get into the causes, you know, and what contributed specifically to Baltimore City's problems. But it is, you know, Baltimore is not the only city that is dealing with this. There are cities throughout the United States that are dealing with this problem of, you know, inadequate sewer infrastructure and backups in people's homes. And so that, you know, it is not being, I think it is a systemic problem and is not really being taken seriously the way it needs to be.
Also too, Yan, if I could just really add to something that Leah said really quickly is that, and we'll probably get into this in another question, but when we think about sort of defining environmental justice in terms of like environmental laws, policies, regulations haven't been applied fairly across all segments of the population, right? You know, Baltimore is a majority minority city, very similar to that of Flint, Michigan, right? And, you know, Leah and I and some other colleagues have started to explore sort of the programmatic and policy, you know, issues related to, you know, addressing the issues of backups. And I think that, you know, when you connect the dots between, you know, historical issues of you know, redlining in Baltimore, majority minority city, the lack of response to a lot of these challenges historically and contemporarily. This is fundamentally an environmental justice issue because had it been, you know, I mean, one can only question that had it been another city that wasn't a majority minority city, these historical issues and chronic issues that Baltimore has faced may or may not be an issue. We'll never know, right? But we do know that there are decades of corroborated evidence that suggests that the context matters, right? And that's why I think it's fundamentally connected to environmental justice.
Absolutely, and I think that definitely sets us up for this next question where we do that deep dive on Baltimore. So thinking through, Baltimore has, of course, struggled with numerous infrastructure issues over the years, and specifically in the parts of Baltimore where there are disproportionately high populations of low-wealth communities and communities of color. So stormwater and wastewater management are just a few of the issues that Baltimore has been facing. What stormwater and sewage issues are some of the residents facing versus maybe other parts of the city? Geographically, when we're thinking about the landscape of Baltimore, the social landscape and the geophysical landscape of Baltimore, what are the disparities there, and what are maybe some of the drivers in those disparities? And I'm sure, you know, we're gonna jump into redlining and racism, but yeah, definitely let's dig deep here just for Baltimore. And I'll start with Leah.
So I'll now get into how this situation started. So in 2002, there was a consent decree between the EPA, the Maryland Department of the Environment, and Baltimore City. And under that, Baltimore was required to address sewer discharges from its sewer system into waterways in the city. And in response to that, the city closed 60 out of 62 relief valves or outfalls into these waterways. But they did that without updating the capacity of the system or addressing the capacity of the system. And so the waste sort of had to go somewhere. And what happened was it went into people's basements in a lot of cases. And this is backed up, you know, this narrative is backed up by data. The Baltimore Sun did an analysis of data. They found that in 2004, residents in Baltimore reported 622 backups. By 2015, they were reporting 7,500 backups in the space of a little bit over a year. And as Marccus mentioned, you know, there's a really serious problem with just refusing to take it seriously as an issue, refusing to really treat this as an issue that deserved any attention or response. And, you know, it is interesting that, for example, the sewer authority that serves the areas around DC, including Montgomery County, which is much wealthier, which is called the Washington Sanitary Sewer Commission, or WSSC, that entity actually does provide direct assistance to the residents who experience backups. So people who live in that area, if they have a backup in their home, they can just call and people come out and clean it up for them. But that's not the case in Baltimore City. And so I think, you know, it is very telling that, you know, it's Baltimore and it's this city where, this problem was people just, the regulators, the regulated entities did not treat this as a serious problem that deserved attention for a long time. Some of the advocacy groups started really raising it in 2015. It was brought to us by Blue Water Baltimore, who, had received multiple complaints from residents about it. And so that's sort of how it came to came into the advocacy space, but it is being taken more seriously now, I think. But I will also mention when we first raised it to the three governmental entities that are involved in this consent decree, which include the US EPA, actually told us that they didn't have the legal authority to require Baltimore City to do anything about this, which, we just said there are several consent decrees elsewhere in the country that require this. So it was a puzzling response from the EPA. But when it comes to the physical landscape of the city, we do have one data set that indicates that there is a correlation between demographic data, percents of African Americans in certain neighborhoods, and increased likelihood of backups occurring in that neighborhood. They are all over the city. There are backups occurring all over the city. So it does require more analysis, and that's one of the things that we're doing with Dr. Hendricks and with some of our other colleagues. But one of the things we've also identified is that elevation plays a role. Homes located at lower elevations are at more risk for experiencing a backup. And it does seem like those homes are often on the cheaper side as opposed to more expensive, so that may play a role as well.
Of course, the implication being that would be lower wealth communities being on the cheaper side. Thanks. Amanda.
Yeah, so the sewer backups are interesting. I get a lot of calls, weekly calls about flooding issues, right? And so it makes sense as we get more and more precipitation, we're gonna have more and more of these challenges that affect residents. And the topography does play a role, right? So one of the things we've thought about is working with real estate agents or housing agencies to identify hotspots that might be particularly vulnerable to intensified rainstorms because they're experiencing this regular flooding. And I wish, I don't know if Pastor Michael Martin has joined us, but he has a particularly interesting story about the work that he's been doing in Baltimore with his community. And so with the flooding, we have, then everything comes downhill. So we're having then trash impacts as well in our waterways. We have things that sort of contribute to those issues that are happening across low-lying areas in Baltimore, the district, in places in Maryland as well. But in Baltimore in particularly, we have a lot of vacant lots in communities. And so what happens with stormwater on those lots? And so that's part of the work that Paul and I are doing there, is to identify sort of where these infrastructure challenges are happening, and if there's some sort of way that those can be addressed holistically. So using a community-based participatory research approach to things in those communities, and trying to address the stormwater challenges at the source rather than downstream from that. Yeah, so I'll let Paul add on with the work in Baltimore specifically.
Sure, and just as a quick check-in, so I don't think Pastor Michael will be able to join us for this session. Okay. Thanks. Go ahead, Paul. And particularly if you could kind of break out what CBPR, community-based participatory research, is and like how it's being done.
Sure, and I'll probably start by leading on from what Amanda said, focusing on this issue of vacancy and abandonment in many low-income communities within Baltimore. I think it's an issue that we're all really well aware of. And these parcels of land that suffer from vacancy really offer very little in terms of stormwater benefit. They're prone to flooding, they have a lot of impervious surface, they have overgrown vegetation. Aesthetically and in terms of stormwater, they're really problematic. And these are neighborhoods that also suffer from low tax revenue. A related environmental issue with regards to vacancy is also trash, right? These vacant lots are sites of illegal dumping of trash, and that leads directly into the issue of disease vector mosquitoes, which is related. This trash fills up with rainwater, provides habitat for vector mosquitoes, and that provides another nuisance and disease threat for these communities. These mosquitoes can vector West Nile virus, they can vector Zika virus, that was an issue a few years ago, and they also provide a nuisance. You know, work up in New Jersey has shown that urban communities beset with mosquito populations often have higher rates of childhood obesity. And there's speculation that that's related to the fact that children don't spend as much time outside and in their backyards and in their neighborhoods because there's such a high mosquito burden. So there's lots of interconnections between vacancy, green space, stormwater, and some of these other environmental issues. We could also talk about rat infestation, which has a long legacy within Baltimore of being poorly managed and also at times being well managed. I think thinking about community-based participatory research, I think what's really key is for stakeholders to really join together and think about how they want to deal with these vacant and abandonment within their communities. And I think we've seen from the city of Baltimore and other municipalities around the country, often a lack of communication with communities on how they manage vacant lots and certain management decisions being made without consultation with people. And that has often meant that there's misunderstanding on the goals of the management. Maybe communities may not understand the benefits of certain management decisions with regards to stormwater. You know, how does a rain garden function? What is its benefits? Can communities have input in what sort of plants are planted within these vacant lots? So I think it's really important to have this community-based participation right from the start of these projects.
Thanks, Paul. Marccus, I'll wrap this question with you.
Yeah, I was just gonna make a few quick points, really sort of building on what Leah said in terms of, you know, the work that we're doing together. We're still in the early, you know, phases of really teasing out sort of how and when, where disparities exist. But I think even before sort of we empirically are able to demonstrate, I think just based off of kind of historical evidence, you know, whether we're talking about the availability of green space and urban heat islands and how that's sort of connected to, you know, redlining and other social issues, I think it's safe for us to sort of, you know, make the hypothesis or the assumption that, you know, it's not a matter of if, but when and how, you know, injustices and inequalities are going to show up. I was trained as a traditional disaster scholar, and, you know, for anybody who studies disasters or any type of crises across scales, we know that sort of social stratification is inherent in any crisis or disaster. And even if we talk about events, but in light of climate change that are becoming much more pervasive, as sort of this idea of an equal opportunity hazard, whether we're talking about Harvey or the sewer backups, yes, they're happening all across the city, but, you know, and more folks are being exposed to them. But because the baseline was never leveled to begin with, we know that injustice is going to rear its ugly head at some point throughout this process, from exposure to recovery. And so I think it's important to note that, because even if in fact, that there's an equal amount of white communities and Black communities that are being exposed, the long game process in terms of, who gets support, how they get that support, who's being dropped from insurance claims, who has the opportunity to fully recover, what impact means for them in terms of being, if they have, other avenues to explore in terms of funds, resources, housing. Those things are fundamentally at the baseline inequitable. And so when you add on this additional layer, it just continues to perpetuate that inequality, right? And so I'm rather confident that, even though we're still in the early phases of, again, sort of identifying the trauma and the inequality empirically, that I think we probably know that it's showing itself, and it will show itself in some way, shape, or form.
Absolutely, and of course, when you layer in the healthcare inequities, in medically underserved areas, and healthcare provider shortage areas, you get there all that quicker. So now pivoting to, we've talked about Baltimore specifically. Let's pivot now to Washington, D.C. and some parts of PG County, Prince George's County, which both areas are also suffering from these same issues having to deal with stormwater. So can we do the same deep dive in this part of the DMV when we're talking about infrastructure issues, environmental health gaps, and then particularly if there are any disparities specifically relevant to the Potomac River versus the Anacostia River. So I'll start off with Amanda.
Sure. So there are similar things happening in Prince George's and the district that are happening in Baltimore in terms of infrastructure failures. And so we see that there are then water quality issues with those. And I think that there are definitely communities that have been more deeply affected than others. If we think about in DC, there's Ward 7 and Ward 8, right? If you're east of the river, you've been disproportionately impacted by all of these environmental triggers beyond just water quality for a long time, right? So thinking about Superfund sites or industrial toxic waste dumps or any type of, industrial discharge that's been happening. Oftentimes we see that in communities of color. And so thinking about that with associated with that come, known cancer clusters in certain areas of the city, of the district in particular, that are on the Anacostia. So thinking about the community of Mayfair and Kenilworth, known areas where people have been exposed to these environmental issues. And then we're also getting, in the Anacostia in particular, the topography is amazing and you get beautiful views of the city, but you do have a hilly environment where you have low-lying areas that are vulnerable to any flooding issues that take place. And the district has a combined sewer overflow system. So as opposed to Baltimore, where you have separate sewer and stormwater systems that in big storms overflow, DC has a combined system, which they've been handling through the big tunnels project. So $550 million project approximately to handle that overflow in systems. And so they're trying to pair that with large infrastructure overhauls to deal with the water quality issues. And then upstream, they're trying to think about sort of these more green infrastructure practices that can be smattered across the landscape. And so that's a great approach in some ways, but I don't know that it's fully recognizes the community input into that system. So, if we're trying to engage our communities in the process of stormwater and integration of these best management practices across the landscape. We have to be thoughtful about what that looks like in terms of maintenance issues with these practices. And so another thing we've been hearing from our partners in Baltimore with Blue Water Baltimore as our project is, we've seen a lot of these projects go in, right? We see bioretentions and we see green infrastructure practices being applied at the ultra-urban watershed scale to deal with some of that impervious surface. But then who's responsible for maintaining them? And so how is the community engaged in that? So are they viewed as amenities in the community? You know, those kinds of questions are important as we see more and more of this in our landscapes. Prince George's County, we have, you know, Brandywine and Bladensburg Park, where we have major health disparities happening in low-income communities there. And Dr. Wilson has done a lot of work on this in this area as well. So I was hoping he would speak to the Prince George's and DC side of things, but I think the rest of the panel can also point out some areas where we've had challenges in those communities and faced major inequalities over a long period of time.
Thanks, Amanda. How about you, Paul?
I think Amanda gave a really good overview there. I'd just like to pick up on this idea of, I guess, community involvement. And so we really know that household scale, small scale best management practices are a really good way, effective way of mitigating stormwater. You know, these are rain barrels, rain gardens, disconnected gutters, and a lot of these have to be put on private lands. And so you've got a range of social issues that come into play, which vary across the landscape and among communities. And unless we really know some of these social issues, it's going to be really hard to implement these small-scale best management practices. And so some research that we've done has shown that there's a lot of variation in knowledge and attitudes towards stormwater and best management practices between affluent and low-income communities. There's a lot of misconceptions. You know, one, for example, was that rain barrels would produce mosquitoes that would cause disease. And we know that if you install a rain barrel properly and if you manage it, it shouldn't at all produce disease vector mosquitoes. So we want to overcome some of these social barriers. I think as environmental scientists, we often have a lot of the technological tools to really know what to do. You know, we can do some pretty advanced modeling to really pinpoint where in a watershed we're having excess nitrogen and phosphorus and stormwater. But it's the implementation of the best management practices which is the real issue. And so we need to take into account a lot of those social and community-based factors. You know, and obviously economics come into play. There may be a lot of best management practices that could be ideal for a certain environmental situation, but if they have a high price tag, then it's very unlikely that certain demographic groups will ever implement them. Also, it may be that certain communities aren't aware of incentive schemes or rebate schemes that can offset some of the costs of implementation. So we need to understand that, and we also need to know effective ways to reach out to these communities, right? And I think that's work that Amanda has done really effectively, knowing kind of what's the appropriate messaging to convey a scientific message to communities and also to receive their feedback. So, yeah, I can let Leah and Marccus also jump in here.
Leah, did you have anything you want to add, or I can jump in?
I don't have that much to add. We haven't actually done that much work on stormwater in the DC or Prince George's area. We have worked on coal plant wastewater in that area. But I will just point out, and you know, with respect to Brandywine, I think that that's an interesting confluence of issues because, of course, we're talking about increased precipitation and the increased severity of storms being a particular problem that's contributing to this. And Brandywine is also the home of 4 permitted gas plants, and there's a nearby coal plant. So I think a lot of, these problems are all concentrated in similar areas, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think, me and Shacovia are starting to do some work, in Brandywine and some other areas, looking at, NATEC events, sort of cascading events between natural hazards and technological risk that are also, emerging environmental justice issues. But I'll touch on really quickly a few things that I've gleaned since doing work throughout the region, particularly in DC and PG County. One is, a project that I'm looking at, working in North Brentwood, Maryland. The first actually, settlement or city that was established and land set aside for returning soldiers of color after the Civil War within the Anacostia Watershed, one of the lowest lying parts throughout that watershed within that floodplain that has had chronic flooding issues since inception. Over the years has struggled to sort of, get support and response related to infrastructure to support these inherent risks that they, took on in terms of just looking at historical factors that are built on racism, classism, that are connected to these issues that are very much so real today and getting worse, in fact. And so we know that, again, a smaller city or town, but still, historically has been predominantly Black and has chronically faced sort of these same types of issues. But then you sort of jumping over the line into DC, me and one of my students are finishing up a paper where we've shown sort of the connection between socially vulnerable groups in DC and pipelines, gray infrastructure. And we've been able to show that, the capacity and the length and of pipes in DC, are inequitably distributed across communities. And so whether we're talking gray infrastructure or green infrastructure, there are inequalities that exist. And in DC, the capacity of underground pipes hasn't kept pace with the level of development in terms of impervious cover. And that's probably true for many of places. But then even when you drill down and sort of unpack those things along the lines of race and class, it's even more so true for communities of color. And I've done, similar work from Houston to DC to Baltimore. It's racism, it's classism, it's infrastructure on repeat, these same types of risks in terms of the type, the inventory, condition, distribution of systems is unequal, right? And there's a layer of unequal protection for certain communities. Dr. Bullitt, in I think one of his more recent books, he talks about the wrong complexion for protection, right? And that's essentially what it is when we're talking about infrastructure and stormwater and wastewater. A lot of people and sewer infrastructure particularly has been probably one of mankind's biggest interventions of health and safety, historically, but I don't think that can always be said for, certain communities, and it's unfortunate. And like I say, more and more through my research program, and I think other folks, and it sounds like what Paul and Amanda are doing, we're building a body of scholarship and research that's being able to demonstrate that.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for touching on all of that in such a thorough way. So when we're talking about Baltimore and DC and these older cities dealing with these infrastructure and industry entrenched issues, so where there's a lot of pavement, a lot of concrete, a lot of asphalt, how can this how can stormwater be best managed in what seems like these kind of worst case infrastructure situations? And I know, Paul, you touched on this a little bit with these kind of more home and near point mitigations, but if you can dig deeper into that, and then also how do we ensure that decisions on stormwater management are taken through an EJ lens or an equity lens, and so that you're not deferring the problem, solving it in one area and deferring it to somewhere else. So I'll start with you, Paul. Sure,
and I think some of the other panelists may be in a better position to address some of the details, certainly at policy level and environmental laws and so forth. But, you know, I think I'll just go back to perhaps what I said before about these small scale best management practices and how when we look at urban areas, you know, the vast majority of urban land is petitioned in these small parcels that are privately owned. And so we really require the cooperation of private landowners in addressing stormwater management. And so that makes it inherently difficult because you've got many different people now around the table, all with their different backgrounds, social barriers, environmental barriers. And so really understanding these differences among communities and individual households is important. And kind of talked a bit about how people might have misperceptions about stormwater and green infrastructure, how people might have certain fears about it. They might relate green infrastructure or green space to crime because in their neighborhood, historically, green space has been unmanaged, overgrown, and it has been centers for crime. So we need to understand that. And I'd also just, I think, pick up on this connection between maybe researchers and communities, because it's something that I've been thinking about quite a bit over the last few years. You know, a lot of researchers that may come from an academic background may not understand a lot of the issues that communities are facing. And so I think there's certain barriers in that regard. You know, a lot of our academics at universities are often foreign born, right? You know, I wasn't born and bred in the United States. I came here. And so there seems often there's a disconnect there as well. You know, it just takes a lot of foreign born academics to really start to understand some of the framework and context within the United States of America that impact upon these environmental issues. And also the different goals between academics and communities. You know, I think a lot of communities may not quite understand how the scientific process rolls out and is implemented, and some of the particular kind of constraints around academics and how we do our job. You know, we may have different goals. Academics, we need to publish papers, we need to find money to do research. Unfortunately, we're not handed money to do research, we have to find it. And so we're often got certain goals that we want to meet in regards to research. And so aligning those research goals to perhaps those of communities that may want to have solutions to very specific problems within communities. So these are some of the issues that I think we need to address and make sure that we all get people around the same table to discuss. Yeah.
Thanks, Paul. I'll kick it back over to you, Marccus.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I wanted to just add briefly that, you know, I'm conflicted in a moment, and I've been increasingly conflicted around sort of what is the end goal, what is the solution, whether it's, you know, policy or programmatic, you know, in terms of addressing these issues. And, you know, a lot of my early work with, you know, and my early published papers are centered around sort of the development of a participatory assessment technique for infrastructure, you know, participatory action, research, community science, citizen science related, you know, opportunities around infrastructure and risk, you know. But what I've struggled with lately or recently is that the burden of participation, right? And I think, the interesting thing about this is that, particularly, communities of color face so many burdens, whether it's the burden of proof, whether it's the burden of being resilient, or whether it's the burden of participation. And I think white communities inherently get certain protections, certain investments, live a certain, quality of life that is just done with no participation at all. Like, just their whiteness protects them. Their whiteness provides investment or drives or these types of things that, communities of color have to participate, have to work 2 jobs and then come home and participate in an additional project just to get something that's inherently received by another community. And so, I think the spirit of environmental justice, right? We know that, a more democratic society, increased participation is a positive and a good thing. I guess for me, it's just like, and obviously I'm an advocate for increased participation. Again, just being transparent in terms of just struggling of, if we really want to get at the root causes of these issues, it seems to me that, these issues of environmental justice are connected to social justice and civil rights and human rights. And in order to get after these issues at the core and correct them once and for all, it really has to be centered on racial policy, reparations, like, civil rights and those types of things. Because in an American context, that's fundamentally what's driving all of these other issues, right? And so, I know that's sort of a big idea and a lot to take on, but I just don't see how you really address these, these other issues without addressing the core issues of racism and classism and that kind of thing.
Sure. Leah.
Well, I want to start by sharing an article. I'm going to share it in the chat just so everybody can look it up if they want to. And the article is from Baltimore Magazine. It's from 2019 by a journalist named Ron Cassie, and it's called Hell and High Water, and it's all about the impacts of flooding and increased stormwater and environmental justice in Baltimore. It's a really, really good article. So as everybody's speaking, it's occurring to me that I'm the only person up here who works for a nonprofit advocacy organization. And I think, it sounds to me like we're all sort of considering how these issues come up in our work and whether they're framed the way that they ought to be framed. I'm when it comes to solutions, I am sort of aware of, some of structural best management practices in terms of, green space and swales and rain barrels and stuff like that. I'm not an expert on it, but I will say, I think, and this is part of why I shared this article, I think it's really critical that we start thinking of this more through a human impacts lens than we do. It comes to me when I hear other people talking about it, it comes to me all the time as a water quality issue, as a bay eutrophication issue, I think mostly about nitrogen and phosphorus. And I'm not saying that's not important, but like when you read the articles about the way it's impacting human beings, it's a very different way to look at it, and I do think we need to do that more. I think I guess the only other, so I think thinking about it through that lens, thinking about how it's harming human beings, like, as Marccus was mentioning, people who are overly burdened with tons of other things, people who are working multiple jobs, people who may be dealing with many other issues in their communities, that may not have time to, participate the way that, the way that might be built into certain models. So I think that I think increasing the amount that we think of these things through a human impacts lens is important. And then I guess the other point that I would make is that the increase, I think people are starting to do this more and more, but I'm thinking more about how this is impacted by climate change, how storms are increasing, and how these sort of flash flood events are affecting people in particular. One thing that I know that our partners at Blue Water Baltimore pushed Baltimore City and the EPA and the Maryland Department of the Environment to do during the most recent update to this consent decree that governs Baltimore's sanitary sewer system. Blue Water Baltimore wanted them to build increased precipitation due to climate change into the model that they use to predict how this is going to impact the system, the repairs that should be made to the system, and they were unsuccessful with that attempt. It has not been built into the model, or it had not been at that time anyway, and it's not required to be built into the model. And I do think, we really need to stop pretending that climate change isn't happening. I think people need to really, sort of build in those increased storm events into decision making.
And Lee, if I could just add something really quick to what Leah said that I think is really important here, Yan, is that, we have emerging solutions, BMPs for addressing these environmental issues. But I think if we don't address these human-related issues, these social-related issues, then effectively we just perpetuate the same inequalities. And so emerging technologies and policies related to climate adaptation, and resiliency then just benefit the same groups that have been benefiting from environmental policy and regulations from the beginning, right? And so we kind of have to, I think that's the core idea around sort of this just transitions, agenda of, we are at a moment where, we are starting to sort of recognize, the human impact to the natural world. And as we sort of implement these policies and technologies in light of this environmental transition, that we have to sort of start with humans and equity in order to mitigate that perpetuation of these long-standing inequalities.
Yan, can I just jump in here? I'm really interested to hear what Leah in particular and all the panelists think about how we message or add messaging related to this issue. Because if you take climate change in particular, I guess our messaging just hasn't worked for the last 4 or 5 decades, right? We've known the impacts about climate change generally, and really there hasn't been much movement in mitigating climate change. And maybe our messaging has focused on the science or the risk, and it's largely been ignored. And so I was wondering if people have any ideas about what sort of values we need to really hone in on, which may affect people's decision-making and really shift the needle in how they view this issue of stormwater and the interrelated environmental context and environmental justice in particular. I don't know if people had that.
Yeah, and I definitely want to hear the answer to this as well. I want to jump in really quickly to say that we've got about 5 minutes left in the panel portion, and then we want to get to some quick Q&A from the audience. But definitely that question dovetails with what Marccus was saying in terms of, and some of the stuff that I'm looking at in my own research, where at the food, energy, water nexus, things are often framed as these wicked problems, but they're not any wicked problems because of technological or engineering reasons. The wicked problems are always governmental or socio-political or geopolitical. But yeah, definitely panelists' responses to Paul's question.
So I would actually, I don't think climate change has been very effectively framed. I think a lot of it, I think it's improving. I think it's getting better. I think there is more of a focus on the impacts on human beings. But I think historically it's been a lot about polar bears. I like polar bears. The warming of the Arctic upsets me, but I don't think that speaks to a lot of people. It feels very distant and hasn't been immediate. And so I think when you talk, especially when you talk about people who have, if you're trying to speak to people who have a lot of other things on their plate, if you're talking about something that's going to happen, far away, later on, the immediacy, the urgency just doesn't come through. And so I think when you talk about it, I do think, we're doing a better job about this, but talking about, first of all, it's talking about local pollutants, because almost big sources of greenhouse gases also, emit toxics. They emit, sulfur dioxide and particulate matter and all sorts of things that have immediate and terrible effects on human health. And so I think using that kind of messaging but also talking about these other things like flooding and these things that people are starting to see more and more in their own lives, flooding, increased severity of storms, that kind of thing, as opposed to sort of, more far off impacts. But there is just one more point that I want to make about solutions, and this is about other levels of government, because I've been talking about Baltimore City and Baltimore City discussions, but these kinds of infrastructure issues are massively expensive to correct. And so the 2017 consent decree modification for Baltimore sanitary sewer system has been valued at $1.6 billion in terms of repairs. And that's really something that the federal government and the state of Maryland should be helping the city with. It's not something the city should have to deal with alone. And so I do think, especially at the federal government, there has been some assistance, but it really, hopefully the upcoming election might help a little bit with this. There needs to be our federal government needs to take infrastructure upgrades and repairs much more seriously.
Thanks. Amanda or Marcus, do you want to respond to the framing of climate change, or do we want to move into the last kind of wrap up question here? Okay.
I'm happy to go to the next question. Yeah.
So kind of going off of what Leah was saying and thinking more about these solutions, what solutions do you see for communities that are negatively impacted by stormwater management issues? How can green infrastructure be incorporated in these solutions? And then how do these communities receive justice and work to mitigate these issues in their own neighborhoods? What's the way forward, the light at the end of the tunnel here? And so I'll start with Marcus.
Yeah, I think, I guess I'll really speak, from a larger policy perspective way forward, which is also interesting because I think something that Leah was alluding to was that, even when it comes to disaster, how we frame disasters or climate change has really been, property centric too. We talk about damage to inanimate objects and structures as opposed to the impact on people, which, in many of ways, the only reason I care about damage to a structure is because it probably has implications for somebody's life or quality of life, right? But otherwise, it's kind of like, how much does it mean? And so I think policy perspective, as we transition and as we think about, adaptation to, increased flooding events and, sanitary, sewer backups and everything, is that, when we talk about the environment, the broader environment, again, it's kind of the infrastructure throughout the environment and, throughout a community is usually a reflection of the quality of housing. And the quality of housing is usually a reflection of who lives there. And so I think we have to sort of have multiple conversations and across multiple policy domains, from like fair housing and equitable housing to, then impacts sort of the quality of infrastructure that folks have access to, that then has sort of that has an understanding or of, you know, the risks that they might face, or how those risks are managed in terms of backups and overflows and flooding and things like that. So I think, again, connecting policies across multiple dimensions of the built environment, from housing to infrastructure. And I also think, you know, again, I think participation is good, and making sure everybody has voice and agency in this process. But I don't want that participation to be a burden, and I'm still trying to figure out what that looks like in terms of, you know, how do we, you know, make sure that, you know, democracy in that way isn't a burden, where other people aren't necessarily having to do things and still receiving the same. I mean, we're always going to have free riders, but that's a different type of free ridership. I mean, you know, in that context, but, you know, more activity, you know, between communities, universities, and municipalities, and then, you know, just policy that's connected across different, you know, dimensions of the built environment.
Thanks. Leah, your final thoughts on this?
Can everyone hear me? I was having difficulty hearing. Okay. Yeah, I thought we were wrapping up for questions, so I kind of gave my answer to this one in the last question. Yeah, I think when it comes to solutions, I do think taking infrastructure maintenance seriously at all levels of government, but particularly the federal government, I think is really critical. And that's something that I see it across all aspects of my work. There's this, cross-cutting theme of infrastructure repair. We did a fair amount of work on explosive trains going through Baltimore, carrying hazardous, potentially explosive, materials. And there's an infrastructure repair issue with rail lines too. So yeah, I just think, taking infrastructure repair seriously and funding it at the federal level is really critical. And taking climate change more seriously, I do think we could message it. And I think the messaging is increasingly better, but I think it could have been messaged better in the past. Yeah, those are sort of my two primary recommendations.
Thanks. We'll do Amanda and then Paul, and then open it up for audience questions. It looks like we've got one in the chat.
Yeah, I agree with what's been said before. The infrastructure is a huge issue, funding the infrastructure, and really things will continue the way they've always continued unless they're addressed at, with these social lenses on them. And, how do we do that across geopolitical boundaries in an effective way? So thinking about how that might happen. And I really am, this idea of the burden, right, is always something that I'm thinking about and I don't have a solution to. And Marccus talked a lot about this. And I think that's really important to try and figure out, right? Where's this, stormwater may not be a priority for most people on a day-to-day. But even in a community where there's so many other priorities that need to happen, right? You need to get your kids to school in the morning and feed them through the day, right? These basic essential things that need to happen. Stormwater is an afterthought unless you're having, the backup in your basement or a flooding issue in your house. And, we know that housing has really lacked infrastructure and updates over time. And so seeing that, if it's not a priority but you also want to engage people in the process, right? How do you find that balance? And so that's really a struggle for me in working in this space, and trying to figure out, how to best serve communities and and I don't know, I think it's something that we'll continue to try and work on, but I don't think we'll address it just by doing what we've been doing, right? We're starting to move forward, and this gets to what Leah's saying. We're not messaging properly in these areas of climate, and the need for infrastructure investment in a way that benefits these communities to date, right? So that's a ongoing thing that we're trying to work on in this space, and make sure that we're moving towards a more equitable, more just water quality environment.
Paul, bring us home.
Oh, I think just a couple of themes came up, which Amanda touched on, was co-benefits. I think thinking about healthy environments and all the different benefits they provide, and finding which benefits really trigger behavior change among different communities. Stormwater may not be high on people's agenda, but if we can link healthy environments that improve stormwater to other benefits, then that may be helpful. I think infrastructure investment, I think, is also really important. From what I understand, and I'm by no means an expert, I thought that was a bipartisan issue, or there's bipartisan agreement on infrastructure investment. I guess that hasn't happened at federal level, and I have big concerns about how functional the federal government is at the moment, but we'll see. But yeah, it would be nice to have infrastructural investment from the federal government. But again, it all comes down to, if you take a little bit of money to invest into infrastructure, it usually has to come from somewhere else. And so, who's going to lose out? So these are big issues.
I thought we were answering solutions. But no, thank you. Thank you for bringing us those perspectives. Thank you to all of our panelists here. I do want to get to this question that's in the chat. So Kathy Michaels, and I'm sorry for time, I'm not going to read the whole question, but Kathy Michaels wants to get at, as a consequence of the problems with flooding and poor water, maybe I do have to read the whole thing. So the built environment contributes to stormwater pollution. Even where jurisdictions have put stormwater control requirements in place for new buildings, such as Montgomery County, developers and builders for both small and big, new and renovation projects often seek waivers and easily get them for a small fee. As a consequence, the problems with flooding and poor water quality are not improved and in fact get worse. What are the solutions? How to improve enforcement and create a level playing field for stormwater controls across development, so that the wealthy don't get to opt out, and opt out setting a precedent for all. So yeah, how do we get to the heart of that corruption and capitalization?
I'll just jump in as a planner. Kathy, if we can figure out a solution to that issue, we would have solved the sort of long-standing problem of urban planning and a collision of sort of these titans within the built environment, in terms of, the public versus the private, and the social versus the physical, how we hold development firms more accountable, how, politicians and, the political nature of the movement of money and how decisions are made. I mean, that's a soap opera in terms of, what that looks like behind closed doors. But I think, at the end of the day, what it is to your point, it's like, it's accountability, it's enforcement, it's, making sure that, development companies and, we hold their feet to the fire in terms of not even just doing the basic, but doing more, right? Because most often they tap into, they build a subdivision or a community and then tap into existing infrastructure that's, I think you laid it out pretty bare in terms of, that's then even more so overwhelming and burdening that infrastructure that's already in disrepair. And I think historically we just you know, if we allow folks to do the bare minimum, that's, I mean, especially from a private perspective where the bottom line, cost saving and, you know, making more money is sort of the goal, they'll do it every single time. And so, you know, I think that's where, folks like Leah and, organizations like EIP come in terms of, which is unfortunate, right? Because folks should be doing the right thing to begin with. It shouldn't take Leah and EIP to come in and threaten litigation in order for folks to do what they should have done to begin with, or for, planners or, municipal, leadership to have requested that or asked of that or enforced it to begin with.
Definitely. And we can afford to go a little bit longer because the room that I have to open next is actually the session that I will be giving, and my co-presenter is also in this room. So we can take a few extra minutes if the rest of the panelists want to address this. But I think, Marccus, I think you pretty much hit it.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I overall agree with that. It seems like it's, I'm not, this isn't an area where we've worked, in terms of enforcing this kind of law, but yeah, I mean, we do a fair amount of enforcement oversight. Yeah, and it's a matter of political will, usually, and, making sure that you have access to the information, and if people are doing things that they aren't supposed to, if the regulator is doing something that they're not supposed to and letting people out of standards that they're supposed to meet, pressing for enforcement of those standards using whatever tools you have, courts, public opinion, yeah, it's just the problem of, I guess you can also look at, if there are laws that are being bent or that are being manipulated, you can try to fix those loopholes. But yeah, a lot of it is just, trying to hold politicians accountable for doing, trying to get them to do things that they should do.
Yeah, and I think, Leah, I think Kathy said, like, where to start. I mean, Kathy, I would say partnerships like what me and Leah have going, right, where you have a scientist or an academic that's able to, develop or provide sort of empirical evidence that then could be handed over to Leah to then advocate with and on behalf of communities. And so I think these collaborations and partnerships between academics and scientists, advocacy groups, communities, I think that's sort of how we, to which what Leah said, we write op-eds, we sort of fire on all cylinders to then draw the attention, bring awareness, and then I think to the, what is amazing about Gen Zers and social media and hashtags and all of this other stuff is that you do sort of draw attention to it all. And then usually when folks have their dirty laundry aired, people start to get moving in terms of, issues that should have been addressed even before all of that kind of stuff.
Thanks, everyone. We'll go ahead and close it out there. I will save the chat and make it available in the Google Drive folder that's been circulating. Once again, I can't thank our panelists enough. I'll do the applause because, well, actually, you guys aren't blocked off. Theoretically, everyone else could turn on their microphones and applause, but hopefully mine will suffice. I greatly appreciate it. Marccus, I see the self claps or the claps to the panel. Great. So moving